I don't think any purchases, I'll say, in the last 6 months on the open market, given the price tips. So in effect, we've already aligned our budget for lower fuel prices, so if this comes about, it will put some pressure on us. The employer retirement contribution rate is increased. The health insurance contribution rate is increased. The impact be about local funding will be $1.25 million, and that was one of the potential risks we included in the proposed budget. We did not know of any specific amounts of increase, and so there is no funding in the current budget for those increases.
Dave, I'm struggling with the math in this 1.25. That seems small.
Yeah, that is just the locally funded piece. For all of our employees that are funded by the state will automatically pick up the benefits costs for the retirement and the health insurance.
Right,
so
so
effectively,
this is
we don't have to come up with that money for
All right,
state
thank
funded
you.
employees.
That helps.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, switching over to the Senate. Again, the Senate's proposal we're anticipating by mid-June. Some comments that have come up out of Senate leadership have included that the $400 million revenue surplus is good news, but it shouldn't lead to too much new spending. The 5% recurring increase in the overall House budget is too much, and that 2.5% to 3% overall increase is much more likely to come out of the Senate. A priority is to end annual transfer of highway tax dollars to budget items that are not related to transportation.
Back on that increase, is it not correct to recognize that they're calling it an increase even though growth is been taken out? So we're not, this becomes even less of a real increase because growth was what? Almost 2%? 1.5%, 2%?
Statewide growth or our growth?
I guess
Our
for our
growth was-
purposes, ours.
Our growth was 2%, but this is statewide. And I'm going to come to some numbers in a couple slides.
Okay.
Thank you.
And let's come back to that.
Yeah.
Though. They want to double the state's reserves and have a minimum of $1 billion in their what they call rainy day fund. Set aside $350 million for Medicaid reform and cut taxes, including a switch to a single factor apportionment for corporate taxes. I won't get into the details of what that is, but basically for corporations that operate in multiple states, there's been something been around since the 60s, some guidelines about how the different states can tax the revenue, who gets what piece of it, and this would be a change to that a lot of states are going to. Again, they have said, the Senate, that they want to increase beginning teacher pay. Questions for the Senate budget?
They have said what? Could you just restate that? I don't think I heard you right.
That they will
Beginning teacher pay. The Senate has said they do want to
They
increase
do want to, okay.
So that's a
from
piece
33 to
of
35.
agreement between the two.
I understand.
And the governor had that.
And the governor.
proposal as well.
consensus.
I understand.
So some questions that we'll have answers to in a couple weeks. Will there be student growth funding statewide in the proposal from the Senate? Will there be funding for drivers training? Funding for salary changes beyond beginning teachers? Salary changes for school administrators, support staff? Funding to retain current levels of teaching assistants. Again, currently a lot of that is non-recurring. The House backfilled it. And funding for any other support of K-12. So, just to go back to the House budget for a minute, to put the potential Senate proposal in perspective. The House proposal has a $519 million increase for public education. And Dr. Martin, that included in that number is growth. They did include growth. I'll have to go back and look at what percent of that total is. I'm guessing it's 150 to 200 million of that is growth, but I can get you that. We can get you that information. So overall, that represents a 6.4% increase in funding for public education. Although, as you point out, that's not all moving forward, some of that's staying in place. And it brings the total appropriation for public education to $8.6 billion. And next, while the Senate proposal is not out, the Senate Education Appropriations Committee has set a spending target at this point. And they have set an $8.2 billion spending target, which represents a $100 million increase over current funding levels, which represents a 1.2% increase. So to compare the two, you see at the top the current year base budget, the House proposal underneath at $8.6 million, the Senate spending limit underneath that target, $8.2 million. You see to the right of that the delta and the delta in percent. And you'll see again that the overall House budget for all categories was a 5% increase, but the focus on education is over the average. And the comments from the Senate were overall we'll see a 2.5% to 3% increase in the overall state budget, and at least with their spending limit that they set, you'll see what that is.
That means that it is likely, if the Senate spending limit goes into place, it is a negative per capita, because it doesn't deal with, if growth is 2% and they're only suggesting 1%, then we don't even meet growth.
Yes, assuming that. I would want to check the statewide growth numbers.
That's unknown at this time.
Again, what will this final state budget look like? There's been a recent history of significant differences between the House and the Senate. I think we're going to see that again. There is no assurance that the positive aspects of the House proposal will prevail into a final state budget. We won't know the state budget until well into the new fiscal year. That's my projection. So what does that mean for Wake County Public Schools today? Well, again, in your proposed budget, you requested $48.3 million. In the county's recommended budget, there is funding of $34.6 million, which leaves a $13.7 million gap. The state house budget actually does partially fund some of the initiatives that were in your proposed budget. However, there's no assurance those will carry over and prevail. So what does that mean as far as closing the gaps? We've got that $13.7 million gap. There's the $1.25 million gap from the employer contribution rate increases. If those go into play, the transportation funding reductions, if those go into play, can create another $3.25 million gap. So what was the $48.3 million for? It was for growth and program continuity, inflation, legislative impact, and new programs. Growth and program continuity, we don't have any choices there. We've got to fund that. Same for inflation. We don't control that. Same for the legislative impact. New programs is the only area where we can make any choices. This is a list of what was included in the new programs. The total funding was $26.7 million. We've already made commitments for a large number of these items. College and career ready assessments, magnet program expansion and theme alignment, the Vernon Malone College and Career Academy, I believe those are 2 teaching positions, the Knightdale High School redesign, the elementary support model, and parent notification system. All that requires $2.2 billion, and those programs have been committed to. So, we have instructional technology facilitators, health services processing tech, office of grants, customer service rep that can come off. Those programs total about $750,000. It doesn't fully close that gap. In fact, it only begins to start, but it would close it down to $12.9 million. So what else is left? If we eliminated that prior page and we have that gap, the remaining new programs that aren't committed to all focus on investing in our human resources. And that was the #1 priority throughout the entire strategic planning process on feedback we received from the community and stakeholders. Local supplement increase for teachers. Salary increase for non-certified staff. And revising the first of the 5 years of revising the active duty schedule, and that supplement increase was also the first of the 5-year phase-in. So, pulling it together, the House proposed budget, I want to stress this, provides no basis for us to assess the final state budget. We know, you know, that our needs and deferred needs from investment in human capital through the actual deferred needs are here and today, regardless of what the state does or doesn't do. And as in most years, perhaps this year a little bit more, timing is everything. So with that, we'll be glad to answer any questions, and it's really your opportunity to have discussion.
Well, the first thing, can you tell us what having an interim budget means for us? As in, what is it, a continuation of this year's budget? Just go into a bit more detail. What's the impact of having an interim budget?
It allows us to continue operations and pay the usual, I think the terminology is usual and ordinary expenses. It allows us to continue to operate.
Mr. Benton?
On the same lines, is there any direct impact on the large number of year-rounds we have starting July 1st?
Of an interim budget? No.
So the
No
teacher,
freezing of positions?
No.
Okay, good.
and the teacher salary schedule stays in place?
Yes.
Any adjustments we couldn't make until after the state budget?
Right,
was
and if there
finalized
are
anyway?
adjustments, I'm sorry,
Okay, and then we would make adjustments
and they'd be retroactive.
retroactive to July 1.
Correct.
And any of the new program initiatives would have to wait.
Yes, that is correct.
And that would include, I mean, I'm glad you highlighted that, Ms. Evans, it would be the elementary support model,
And the Nightdale.
The Nightdale.
Redesign.
all those new programs that
Now,
are just on the slide.
No.
Some of those.
Because we already have investment in some of them.
Not all of
Some
them.
of them we've
Not all.
already committed to.
I will say this, using the elementary support model,
Okay.
I showed you the local funding impact.
Mhm.
The majority of funding for that came from federal funding, Title I. So in that example, we would not be constrained from moving forward
Okay.
with the majority of it.
What would be some examples of things that we would be constrained in moving forward?
We would be.
That's my question. These, and again, it's possible we could find some funding within existing budget to begin some of these initiatives. So it's not like we're gonna have to just put a stop sign out, but we wanna be cautious and not go too far forward, because if we do have to make any changes. But again, these are things we've committed to. Okay. Mr. Fletcher, then Mr. Hill.
Come back to Mr. Benton's question. The TA funding was non-recurring from the state. And non-recurring funding would affect, or would it not affect, teaching assistants in year-round school?
It would, our likely recommendation, since we won't have a state budget, and let me go beyond that. Let me say we don't know if the final state budget will fund growth.
Right.
So that not only would be for the year-round schools an impact on teachers and all the other resources we allot based upon ADM. And we have two ways to play it. One is to say, let's assume the worst and we don't get, which means we can't hire the people we need to hire and get them in place. And if we wait too long into the season, we're not going to get the best talent.
Right.
Or we can hire them, and then if the funds aren't there, have to deal with it after the fact. We will not put a freeze in place at this point in time.
And I believe that's the right decision. It's a crapshoot for anybody who's looking for a job. But it would be the same odds in any county in North Carolina at the moment.
Yes.
And that's not healthy for us educationally across the state. That's a real challenge. We might, yeah.
Mr. Hill.
I guess my concern or question has to do with these commitments that we've made, that if we were able to find some funding that could be shifted, stopgap until, if the until never came, my concern would be that we've started something that we have to stop. We've put money into it and nothing good came out of it either. So I guess that's where my question or concern is, which of these programs, if we start them and have to stop, have we just wasted a month or two and some money?
Well, I guess it's a valid point, Mr. Hill. I do believe, well, I don't believe we're going to have the final state budget by the
Right.
middle of June. I think we'll have one in July. I don't think we're going to go that far down the road.
And so we won't have spent too much of that money.
I'd rather not spend any of it if we don't know, and that's the catch-22, because then we, I guess, suffer the chance of an opportunity cost to get started, as opposed to the opportunity cost of if we waste some money.
The other thing I would point out, that whatever might be expended in planning and structuring at the beginning of a new program would not be wasted. It might just have to be put on pause.
Well, that would be durable, yes, if it was just the planning.
And in the House budget for TAs, does it allow for expansion of TAs to 10 months instead of adding positions? It's still, it would be the
No.
same level?
It's basically keeping the existing
Keeping
funding
the
levels
existing
in
levels where
place
we are.
as opposed to going backwards.
So even with elementary growth, it doesn't take that into account for additional teaching assistants.
Any further questions for Mr. Nieder? Thank you, sir, for the
Man, that would
update.
make this work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we now move to preliminary design on 5 projects. Mr. Desiremore's been busy.
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
You will find 3 attachments for this item in e-boards. One is this presentation. The second is a facility needs list, which has also a facility condition index for each of the district schools. The needs are grouped together in categories in order to simplify the info. And the third attachment provides you some additional detail of what is in each one of those categories. Now, 3 weeks ago, the members of the Facilities Committee received a list of 5 projects that staff has recommended for preliminary design work to fully define the scope of the projects at those schools. This presentation will offer you some of the detail about how those 5 schools were selected. As part of the funding of a capital improvement plan, we continue to assess the conditions of our buildings every year. That includes accomplishing preliminary designs on some projects in order to fully define the scope and update the prioritization of projects that are located below the current construction funding line. For example, in the current bond, it includes funding for design and some partial funding for construction for these schools: Apex High, East Wake Middle, Stow Elementary, and Vandover Springs. However, the list of needed repairs is always much longer than the capital funding available. This is a screenshot of that list I told you one of your handouts is. It's the current list of facility needs. And the list goes on for more than 150 schools. And the total comes to somewhere around $350 million just in life cycle requirements that are identified. The assessment process is continuous, like I said earlier, but it takes several years to cover the 170 plus schools and over 22 million square feet in the school system. The lag between identifying the needs and actually providing the repairs can be significant enough to revisit the estimates on these schools and on the work that's required. In other cases, the individual system's needs can be large enough that they trigger the need for code changes, building or site changes, which all increase the complexity of the job and then result in the need for more design to fully define the scope. These are the schools that we reported to the Facilities Committee meeting that we feel are in need of new funding for additional design work. The schools are Northridge Elementary, Fuquay-Varina High School, Wendell Elementary, West Millbrook Middle, and York Elementary. Now, I want to emphasize that these 5 schools are not the only schools with significant needs. In fact, they aren't even the ones that rank the highest on our facility condition index. As you see here, these are just the schools that need additional design work due to the lag since the last review, or they have had significant increases in scope. There are schools with a higher score on the facility condition index, but we are confident that no additional design review is needed at this time for us to determine the priority of those schools in respect to all the other projects in the system. Once we have a more accurate facility condition index ranking for each school, we can move to the next step in this process. This screenshot is also from the more detailed handout that all of you have, and it shows the facility condition index for more than 150 schools. If you look closely, you can see where a school's needs fall relative to needs of other facilities. And we've highlighted the 5 schools that we're recommending on designs on this slide. Just a reminder, the index is calculated by adding all the school's needs together and dividing it by the replacement value for the school. And this helps us compare the need between different size schools and the different requirements that are found in each school.
Can you state that one more time?
Sure. The index is calculated by adding all the school's needs together and dividing it by the replacement value for the schools.
And by replacement value, you mean just tearing down the entire?
If you were to build the building from scratch.
From scratch. Okay. But based on, so for Swift Creek, you would just use its current design and do the work that's.
The current information